The barn had been locked for almost 19 years. Walter Hayes would later wonder how much longer it might have stayed that way if the county inspector hadn't told him the south roof wouldn't survive another winter. At 74, Walter had learned not to argue with rotten buildings or old doors. He hooked a crowbar beneath the bottom plank and leaned into it carefully. The wood resisted. Then something inside the frame snapped. The door lurched open 6 inches. Dust rolled through the gap. Walter stepped back and waited. Old barns had their own way of warning you. A loose beam. A rusted thing. A nail waiting beneath the dirt. He pushed the door wider. The smell came next. Dry hay. Mouse nests. Damp timber. And underneath it all, something Walter hadn't expected. Engine oil. He stopped. Nothing with an engine had been stored in this barn for years. Walter switched on his flashlight. The beam moved across broken fencing, a rusted cultivator, stacks of lumber, and machinery so old that some of it had belonged to his father. Most of it was junk. That was why Walter was here. Before winter, the barn had to be emptied. Anything worth saving would go to the machinery shed. Anything worth selling would go to Roy Tanner's scrapyard. Everything else would burn. Walter took 3 steps inside. His flashlight passed across a collapsed canvas near the back wall. Then, he brought the light back. Something red showed beneath it. Not bright red. Just a narrow strip of faded paint beneath decades of dust. Walter stared at it. He knew that color. He crossed the barn slowly and pulled the canvas away. A tractor sat underneath. For several seconds, Walter didn't move. The rear tires had split along the sidewalls. One front wheel had sunk several inches into the dirt floor. Rust covered the rims, and a bird had built a nest behind the steering column. But none of that was what Walter saw. He saw a summer afternoon. His father's hands on the steering wheel, a boy running beside the rear tire, a machine Walter had not seen since childhood. No. He wiped the hood with his sleeve. A streak of faded red appeared beneath the dust. Walter had spent most of his life believing this tractor was gone. His father had stopped using it sometime after the war. Years later, when Walter asked what had happened to it, Elias had simply said it wasn't worth keeping. Walter had assumed it had been sold. Apparently, his father had lied, or Walter had misunderstood. At 74, there weren't many people left. He could ask, which one? He stood beside the tractor for a long moment. Then instinct replaced memory. A machine was either seized, broken, or waiting to tell you what was wrong. Walter set the flashlight on the fender and reached for the hood latch. It resisted. He worked it loose. The hood lifted with a metallic groan. Dust covered everything beneath it. But the engine was surprisingly complete. Carburetor, distributor, manifold, fuel line. Walter leaned closer. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained why Elias Hayes had hidden the machine instead of selling it. Then Walter noticed the copper. A narrow pipe ran along the side of the engine. He frowned. He had repaired enough equipment in 74 years to recognize the difference between something installed at a factory and something installed by a farmer who needed a machine working before morning. This pipe belonged to the second category. Walter wiped it with his thumb. Dark copper appeared beneath the grease. He followed the line. It entered the intake manifold through a hand-cut fitting. That made him stop. Walter checked the gasoline system again. Fuel tank. Carburetor. Fuel line. All still there. So, why would anyone add another line directly into the intake? He followed the copper pipe backward. It connected to a small cylindrical chamber mounted beside the engine. Beyond that sat a crude valve with a wooden handle. The welds were ugly. Functional. Made by someone who cared more about tomorrow's field than tomorrow's appearance. Walter leaned closer. This wasn't a repair. A repair returned a machine to the way the manufacturer had built it. Someone had wanted this engine to breathe through a second system. Walter aimed the flashlight into the open end of the copper line. Something black coated the inside. He scraped it with the tip of his pocket knife. The residue came away dry. He rubbed it between his fingers. Soot. Walter's expression changed. Gasoline shouldn't have left soot there. Something else had traveled through that pipe. Something that burned. And suddenly, without warning, Walter remembered smoke. Not this barn. Another morning. Cold enough that his breath had hung in front of him. He was 8, maybe 9. His father was standing beside this tractor. Behind the seat was something tall and made of steel. Walter remembered Elias opening it. Remembered heat. Remembered the smell of wood smoke. Except it hadn't smelled exactly like wood smoke. Then his father's voice. "Don't touch that." Walter closed his eyes. The rest was gone. He opened them and looked at the engine again. The copper pipe. The chamber. The handmade valve. What had his father built? Walter moved the flashlight lower. Near the exhaust manifold, beneath a crust of grease, something reflected the beam. A small steel plate. He wiped it once. Nothing. He spat on the corner of his handkerchief and rubbed harder. 2 letters appeared. E. H. Walter stopped breathing for a moment. He rubbed beneath them. There was more. 4 numbers. E10 Jobai Sishersen. Walter sat back on his heels. Elias Hayes. His father. E10 Jobai Sishersen. Walter knew enough about that year without opening a history book. War. Rationing. Shortages. Farmers still had fields to plant, whether gasoline was easy to find or not. He looked again at the second intake line. At the soot. At the crude valve his father had marked with his own initials. For nearly 80 years. Walter had remembered Elias as a man who fixed whatever broke. But this wasn't a repair. His father had changed the machine because something the tractor needed had become difficult enough to obtain that ordinary repairs were no longer the answer. Walter lowered himself onto an overturned bucket. Outside, the orchard moved in the afternoon wind. Dead apple branches lay beneath the trees in piles. Walter had been meaning to burn for years. Inside the barn, the tractor waited beneath 19 years of dust. Walter had entered that morning to decide what should be thrown away. Instead, he'd found a machine his father had hidden. A second fuel path that shouldn't have existed. Soot where gasoline shouldn't have left it. And a date stamped into steel from one of the hardest years the farm had ever survived. Walter looked once more at the copper pipe. He still didn't know what had gone through it. But he knew one thing now. In 1943, Elias Hayes had needed this tractor badly enough to teach it to burn something it had never been designed to use. And somewhere on this farm, Walter suspected, the missing half of that machine was still waiting to be found. For 3 days, Walter didn't touch the tractor, but he thought about it every time he spent money. On Monday morning, a white envelope from the diesel supplier lay on his kitchen table. Walter opened it beside his coffee. Emayan. Babai Sishalu. He stared at the number longer than he needed to. Then he placed the invoice beside another sheet of paper. Spring fertilizer estimate. That number was worse. Walter folded both documents in half and slid them beneath the ceramic salt shaker his wife had bought 37 years earlier. It was an old habit. Bills he couldn't solve immediately went under the salt shaker. Lately, there were more papers beneath it than salt inside it. The farm wasn't bankrupt. Walter almost wished it were. Bankruptcy was a door slamming shut. What Walter faced was a door that remained open just wide enough to keep walking through. He still owned 112 acres. The house was paid for. The barns were his. So were the orchard, the fields, and enough aging machinery to make the place look functional from the county road. On paper, Walter Hayes owned a farm. What he didn't own anymore was margin. Every season demanded money before the first seed went into the ground. Fuel, fertilizer, filters, bearings, hydraulicos, tiers. Parts that used to cost $20 now seemed to cost $80. Repairs that once took an afternoon now required a technician, a laptop, and an invoice Walter didn't want to open. He could still do the work. That wasn't the problem. At 74, Walter's hands still knew how to mend fence, sharpen blades, rebuild a carburetor, and tell from the sound of an engine when something wasn't right. What those hands could no longer do was outrun arithmetic. His son understood that better than anyone. Daniel came Sunday afternoon. He found Walter at the kitchen window, looking toward the southern field. "You got another offer." Walter didn't turn around. "I know." Daniel placed the envelope on the table. The developer wanted 68 acres along the county road. Enough land to split the farm almost in half. The offer was respectable. More than respectable. Walter could sell. Repair the house. Replace the leaking roof over the machinery shed. Put the rest away. And never worry about the price of diesel again. Daniel stood beside him. "You don't have to prove anything." Walter kept looking through the glass. "I'm not proving anything." "Then why keep doing this?" Walter glanced at him. Daniel immediately softened his voice. "I'm not telling you to leave. You're telling me to sell. I'm telling you the farm doesn't have to die with you standing on it." That landed harder than Daniel intended. Walter looked back toward the fields. For most of his childhood, those acres had never been quiet. Cattle moved behind the fences. Corn stood along the road. Hay dried in windrows. His mother kept a garden large enough to feed half the family. The orchard produced more apples than they could store. 3 generations of Hay's children had learned to work somewhere inside that view. Now almost a third of the ground sat unused. Daniel pointed toward the southern acreage. "You're spending money to keep land that isn't paying you back." Walter said nothing, because his son was right. That was the worst part. If Daniel had been insulting the farm, Walter could have argued. If the developer had offered a ridiculous price, Walter could have refused. But the numbers were reasonable. The offer was reasonable. Selling was reasonable. And Walter was beginning to hate that word. After Daniel left, he walked the orchard. Several trees hadn't produced well in years. Storm damage still lay between the rows from the previous winter. Dead limbs leaned against trunks or disappeared beneath grass. Walter picked up one branch. Dry applewood. He had spent years treating pieces like it as a problem. Cut them, pile them, haul them, burn them when the weather allowed. He snapped the branch across his knee. The break was clean. Walter stared at the pale wood inside. Then something from the barn returned to him. Black residue. Inside the copper pipe. Soot. He looked at the branch again. A memory surfaced. Smoke rising behind his father's tractor. A tall steel cylinder. Elias standing beside it with one hand wrapped in a rag. Walter had been a boy. He remembered his father dropping pieces of something into the top. Not liquid. Pieces. Walter's grip tightened around the apple branch. He walked back toward the barn. Fast at first. Then faster. The old tractor stood exactly where he'd left it. Walter set the branch on the workbench and opened the hood. This time, he wasn't looking at the machine as a son. He was looking at it as a mechanic. He traced the original fuel system first. Tank. Fuel line. Carburateur. Normal. Then he traced the modification. Copper pipe. Mixer. Intake manifold. Whatever entered that second line bypassed the normal route from the gasoline tank. Walter loosened the fitting. More black residue coated the inside. He scraped some onto a white rag. Soot. An engine required air. Compression. Ignition. And something capable of burning. The tractor already had a system for gasoline, so Elias hadn't added that second path because the first one was missing. He had added it because he wanted another way to feed the engine. Walter crouched lower. His flashlight caught 4 holes in the frame. He hadn't noticed them before. 2 on each side. The paint around them was worn differently from the surrounding metal. Something heavy had once been bolted there. Something that vibrated. Something that was now gone. Walter measured the spacing, then searched the barn. Behind a grain drill, he found a length of heavy steel pipe. Under a broken wooden trough lay a circular metal grate. Farther back, half buried beneath old fencing, he uncovered a rusted housing with a fitting on one side. Walter carried each piece to the tractor. None explained the system alone. Together, they began to tell a story. A chamber, a grate, heat-blackened steel, a pipe leading toward the engine. Walter stood very still. He looked again at the plate beneath the hood. H. Iten Jobai Sishasan. That year no longer felt like a date. It felt like a clue. Wartime rationing hadn't stopped fields from needing to be plowed. Cows still needed feed. Hay still had to be cut. Food still had to leave farms, whether farmers could easily buy fuel or not. Walter looked at the tractor. His father hadn't been trying to build something clever. He had been trying to keep working. And suddenly Walter understood why that bothered him so much. 83 years ago, Elias Hayes had faced a version of the same problem sitting beneath Walter's salt shaker. The farm depended on something it couldn't control the price or supply of. Elias had responded by changing the machine. Walter had responded by considering selling the land. He didn't know whether that comparison was fair. He didn't know whether the old system could ever work again. And he certainly didn't know whether an 80-year-old idea had any place on a modern farm, but now he needed to understand it. Walter turned toward the barn entrance. Beyond it, the orchard stretched downhill in uneven rows. Dead branches covered the ground. He looked at the applewood still in his hand, then back at the soot inside the pipe. Wood. Smoke. A second intake. For the first time, those clues stopped feeling separate. Walter walked back to the tractor and aimed his flashlight behind the manifold. There had been more to his father's machine. Something large enough to bolt onto the frame. Something that had been removed before the tractor was hidden. If Walter could find it, he might finally understand what Elias had been feeding into that engine. And perhaps something else. The diesel invoice was still waiting beneath the salt shaker. The developer's offer was still on the table. Neither problem had disappeared. But for the first time in years, Walter was asking a different question. Not how much longer he could afford to keep the farm, but what the farm already had that he had stopped noticing. The next morning, Walter returned before sunrise. He brought a wire brush, penetrating oil, 2 wrenches, and the notebook he used for machinery repairs. This time, he wasn't restoring anything. He was reconstructing what had been removed. Walter began with the 4 empty mounting holes on the tractor's frame. Their edges were worn. Something heavy had once vibrated there for years. He measured the spacing, then carried the measurements to the pieces he'd found behind the grain drill. The rusted cylindrical housing matched. So did the bracket welded to its base. Walter set it beside the tractor. For the first time, the modification began to make physical sense. The cylinder had once stood vertically beside the engine. A pipe would have carried something from it toward the strange chamber under the hood, through the copper line, and finally into the intake manifold. But one question remained. What had entered the cylinder? Walter cleaned the larger housing. Near its bottom was an opening surrounded by heat discoloration, not ordinary rust. The steel had been repeatedly heated. Above it was another fitting. Below it sat the circular grate he'd found the night before. Walter stared at the pieces. Fire below. Fuel above. Gas leaving through the side. He stopped. No. The word escaped before he realized he'd spoken. Walter went into the house and searched through an old cabinet where family papers had accumulated for decades. Equipment manuals, tax receipts, seed invoices. Then, inside a cracked leather folder, he found a photograph. It showed his father standing beside the same tractor. Walter brought the picture to the window. The tractor looked different. Behind Elias was a tall steel cylinder. A pipe ran from its top toward the engine. Walter turned the photograph over. 3 words were written in pencil. October. Wood unit. That was enough. Walter finally had a name for what he was looking at. A wood gas system. The principle was old. Wood could be heated with a restricted supply of oxygen. Instead of simply burning completely into heat and ash, part of it could be converted into a combustible gas mixture. That gas could be cleaned, mixed with air. And if the system was built correctly, fed into certain internal combustion engines. Walter looked back at the tractor. The copper pipe was no longer mysterious. It was a fuel path. The strange chamber wasn't decorative. It had helped clean or regulate the gas before it reached the engine, and the handmade valve controlled how much air entered with it. His father had built a tractor that didn't have to depend entirely on liquid fuel. But Walter also understood something immediately. This wasn't free energy. The system needed dry fuel. It needed heat. It needed controlled airflow. Dirty gas could carry tar and particles into an engine. Get the mixture wrong, and the tractor wouldn't run. Get the system dangerously wrong, and the carbon monoxide in producer gas could kill a man before he realized anything was happening. This machine had demanded knowledge. Walter returned to the barn and examined every component again. Then he found something he'd missed. Scratched into the metal beside one adjustment valve were 3 marks. 1 start, 2 hot, 3 load, not factory markings. Instructions. His father's instructions. Walter copied them into his notebook. Below the tractor, he noticed another small object buried in the dirt. A brass wing nut. He dug around it with a screwdriver. Something metallic lay underneath. Walter pulled free a thin, rusted plate. Most of the writing had disappeared, but one sentence remained readable. Dry orchard wood first. Walter read it twice. Then he turned toward the barn doors. Beyond them stood the neglected orchard. Dead limbs covered the ground between the trees, the same branches Walter had burned, piled, and cursed for years. Until that moment, they had been waste. Now he looked at them differently. His father hadn't merely found another fuel. He had designed the tractor around something the farm produced by itself. And somewhere between the old orchard and the machine under this hood was the reason Elias Hayes had gone to all this trouble. Walter spent the next 2 days looking for the missing half of his father's machine. The pieces beside the tractor weren't enough. The rusted housing could separate debris. The copper line could carry gas. The handmade valve could control what entered the engine. But none of them could explain where that gas came from. Something was missing. Something that had once held fire. Walter searched the barn twice. Nothing. Then he remembered the machinery shed behind the orchard. Its roof had collapsed years ago. He hadn't gone inside since his wife was alive. By noon, Walter was pulling sheets of corrugated metal away with the loader. Underneath lay decades of forgotten equipment, broken cultivators, fence wire, a feed trough turned upside down. Walter moved the trough, then stopped. Behind it stood a steel cylinder, nearly waist-high, too heavy to be an ordinary barrel. Walter climbed down. The lid was thick and clamped tight. Near the bottom was a small opening. Inside, several inches above the base, sat a heavy grate. The steel around it wasn't merely rusted. It had been burned. Again and again. Walter stared at the chamber. Wood above, air below, fire near the grate. A pipe fitting near the top. He didn't need the rest, explained. This was the missing piece. He dragged the cylinder into daylight and carried the separator from the barn. The fittings matched. Walter connected them loosely on the ground. Gasifier, separator, pipe, engine. For the first time, his father's modification became a complete machine. Wood went into the cylinder. A restricted amount of air entered below. Heat did something inside. Whatever came out traveled toward the tractor. Walter understood the path. What he didn't understand was how Elias had made it work without destroying the engine. That answer was waiting beneath a rotted toolbox. Walter found a narrow metal case buried under it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper wrapped in oilcloth. He recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's. Walter sat down in the dirt. The first page contained dimensions. Pipe sizes. Valve position. Distances between components. The second showed the tractor from the side, with the steel cylinder mounted behind it. The third page was different. No drawing. Just mistakes. Wet wood, weak gas. Too much air burns hot. Wastes, fuel. Dirty filter engine loses pull. Walter read the final line twice. Elias had underlined it. Tar means you're doing something wrong. Walter smiled. His father had never wasted 10 words when 5 would do. Then he noticed another note near the bottom. Apple and oak. Dry. Cultivan. Walter looked toward the orchard. Suddenly, the rusted plate he'd found near the tractor made sense. Dry orchard wood first. It hadn't been a sentimental message. It was an instruction. His father hadn't simply discovered that wood could fuel an engine. He had discovered that the wrong wood could ruin the attempt. Moisture mattered. Size mattered. Airflow mattered. The fuel had to be prepared before the machine ever needed it. Walter picked up a dead apple limb beneath the shed roof. It snapped cleanly across his knee. For years, he'd seen branches like this as debris. His father had seen fuel waiting to dry. That afternoon, Walter laid every surviving component across the barn floor. Gasifier, separator, filter, mixer valve, engine. He drew chalk arrows between them. The system was finally whole. And that was when understanding became temptation. Walter no longer wanted to know whether the machine had worked. He wanted to know whether it still could. He also knew enough to be afraid of it. Producer gas could contain carbon monoxide. An old homemade system could leak. Dirty gas could carry tar into the engine. One careless test inside the barn could turn an experiment into a funeral. Walter opened his notebook. At the top of a clean page, he wrote, "Outdoors only. Check every joint. Clean every line. Replace every seal." Then, beneath those rules, he added one final sentence. "Try one start." Walter stared at it. He knew himself well enough to recognize the lie. By sunset, he had already begun rebuilding the machine. His father had stopped using 83 years earlier, and for the first time, Walter wasn't searching for the past. He was preparing to ask it a question. 6 days later, Walter rolled the tractor into the open yard. He had replaced the cracked hoses, cleaned the copper lines, resealed the fittings, and rebuilt the crude filter housing. The gasifier stood behind the tractor again. Not beautiful, not restored, functional. Walter had one rule: nothing would be tested inside the barn. Producer gas could contain carbon monoxide, and he wasn't going to gamble with something he couldn't see or smell. He filled the chamber with dry wood cut from the orchard. At the bottom, he started a small fire. The first smoke was thick and white. Walter waited. His father's notes had one instruction circled: don't feed engine until hot. As the chamber heated, the smoke changed. Walter watched the temperature, checked the joints, then opened the line leading toward the separator. The gas traveled through the old system for the first time in decades. Separator, filter, copper pipe, mixer, engine. Walter's hand rested on the starter. He hesitated, then pressed it. The engine turned. Nothing. He adjusted the air valve. Tried again. The engine coughed. Walter froze. Another turn. A second cough. Then the old tractor fired. The sound was uneven and weak, but unmistakable. Walter laughed. "Come on." The engine caught again. 5 seconds. 10. 20. For 23 seconds, the tractor his father had modified in 1943 ran without gasoline feeding it in the normal way. Then it died. Walter restarted it. This time it ran nearly a minute. He pushed the throttle slightly. The engine stumbled, then stopped. Walter looked at the gasifier. Smoke leaked from a fitting near the separator. He tightened it and tried again. The third attempt was worse. The engine coughed violently. A dark, sticky liquid appeared inside one of the lower pipes. Walter touched a drop with the end of a screwdriver. Thick, brown-black, tar. His excitement disappeared. He remembered the sentence from Elias's notes. Tar means you're doing something wrong. Walter shut everything down. For an hour, he waited for the system to cool. Then he began taking it apart. The problem was obvious once he opened the pipes. Sticky deposits coated the inside. The filter was already dark. Some of the gas entering the engine had carried condensable compounds that should never have reached the intake. Walter looked at the pile of wood beside the gasifier. It felt dry. But felt dry wasn't a measurement. He split one piece. The center was noticeably cooler and darker. Walter understood. The branches had been lying beneath a roof. But several were much thicker than the pieces shown in Elias's sketch. Others had been cut only weeks earlier. He had treated wood as if wood were one uniform fuel. It wasn't. Moisture mattered. Size mattered. Temperature mattered. Airflow mattered. If the gasifier never reached the right operating conditions, it could produce dirty, tar-heavy gas, instead of the cleaner fuel the engine needed. Walter spent the afternoon cleaning the system he had just rebuilt. It was slow, filthy work. By sunset, the tractor looked exactly as it had that morning, motionless. Daniel arrived while Walter was scraping residue from a pipe. "So," Walter held up the tar-covered screwdriver. "It ran." Daniel looked at the silent tractor. "For how long?" Walter didn't answer immediately. "Not long enough." Daniel glanced toward the gasifier. "Maybe there's a reason people stopped using these things." Walter couldn't argue with that. There was. Modern fuel was easier, cleaner, more convenient. This old system demanded constant attention. But after Daniel left, Walter opened Elias's notes again. He read every line slowly. Then he noticed something he'd overlooked. Beside apple and oak, dry, cultivan, Elias had written 3 smaller words. Stack one summer. Walter looked toward the orchard, then toward the machinery shed. Behind it stood an old covered wood rack Walter hadn't touched in years. He walked over and pulled away the rotting tarp. Underneath were neatly cut blocks of applewood, almost identical in size. Walter picked one up. Light, hard, bone-dry. His father hadn't simply written down what fuel to use. He had left behind the fuel itself. Walter looked back at the tractor. The first test hadn't proven the machine was useless. It had proven something more important. Walter understood the idea. Elias had understood the details. The applewood changed everything. Walter carried 3 blocks from the old rack and placed them beside the wood he'd used during the failed test. The difference was obvious now. His pieces varied wildly, some thick as fence posts, others little more than branches. Elias's were almost uniform. Walter weighed several in his hands. They were noticeably lighter. He split one. The center was pale and dry. No coolness. No damp smell. That afternoon, Walter stopped trying to make the tractor run. Instead, he studied the fuel. That distinction mattered. He cut the old applewood into consistent pieces and screened out bark, dirt, and rotten material. Then he emptied the gasifier completely and removed the sticky deposits from the previous attempt. The work took most of the day. By evening, Walter understood why his father's notes were so specific. A gasifier wasn't simply a stove connected to an engine. Inside the chamber, several processes had to happen in sequence. The wood heated. Moisture had to leave. Part of the material broke down under heat. Combustion supplied additional heat. Then hot carbon helped transform part of the gases into a combustible mixture. If the system remained too cool, or the fuel introduced too much moisture, unwanted vapors and tar could survive long enough to travel downstream. That was what Walter had done wrong. He had tried to operate an old system without respecting the conditions that made the system work. The following morning, he rolled everything outside again. This time he changed only one major variable: the fuel. Dry, uniform, old. Walter lit the chamber and waited. He didn't rush when smoke appeared. He didn't touch the starter when the first gas reached the line. He watched the fire establish itself and let the gasifier heat. Then he checked every connection. When he finally opened the mixer valve, he followed the markings Elias had scratched into the metal. One start. Walter pressed the starter. The engine turned, cuffed. He adjusted the air. It fired. Walter kept his hand away from the throttle. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The engine continued running. Walter looked toward the exhaust. The rhythm wasn't perfect, but it was steadier than before. 2 minutes. 5. Walter moved the valve toward the second mark. Too hot. The engine note changed. Smoother. He climbed onto the seat. For a moment, he simply held the steering wheel. The last time this tractor had moved under its own power, Walter might still have been a child. He depressed the clutch, selected first gear, released it slowly. The tractor rolled forward, only 6 feet. Walter stopped, then laughed. Not because 6 feet mattered, because the machine had just answered a question that had been sitting beneath that barn roof for decades. He drove another 20 yards across the yard. When he reached the slight incline beside the orchard, he moved the valve toward the third scratched mark. 3 load. The engine struggled. Walter adjusted the mixture. The tractor climbed. Slowly, far more slowly than a modern diesel would have. But it climbed. At the top, Walter shut it down. He didn't need another test that day. He looked from the tractor to the rows of aging apple trees. Dead limbs covered the ground beneath them. For years, Walter had paid with his labor to cut that material, pile it, haul it, or burn it. His father had looked at the same cycle differently. The orchard produced fruit. The orchard also produced prunings, dead limbs, and damaged wood. Some of that dry, woody material, properly prepared, had once helped power the machine that worked the farm. Walter picked up one of the remaining applewood blocks. The discovery under the hood was becoming larger than the tractor. Elias hadn't eliminated the farm's need for outside resources. He had done something more practical. He had learned to recognize a resource that was already there. Walter looked across the neglected orchard. For the first time in years, he didn't see branches waiting to be cleared. He saw inventory. Walter waited 4 days before putting the tractor under real load. Making an engine idle in the yard was one thing. Making it work soil was another. He chose the smallest field on the farm, 7 acres behind the orchard that hadn't been planted in 2 seasons. Daniel called it the retirement field. Walter called it the test. He wasn't interested in proving the old tractor could replace his diesel equipment. It couldn't. What he wanted to know was simpler. Could a machine powered partly by material the farm already produced perform useful work? Walter attached an old 2-bottom plow. He filled the gasifier with prepared applewood, brought the system up to temperature outdoors, and waited until the engine settled into a steady rhythm. Then he lowered the plow. The tractor nearly died. Walter immediately raised it. "All right," he muttered. "You don't like that. On gasoline." The old engine had once pulled the implement without much complaint. On producer gas, it didn't have the same strength. That mattered. The modification hadn't created a better tractor. It had created a compromise. Walter reduced the depth of the plow and tried again. This time the tractor moved. Slowly. The engine labored as the blades entered the soil, but the wheels kept turning. Walter watched the temperature and listened carefully to the engine. Every few passes, he stopped to check the system. The work was inconvenient. The gasifier needed attention. The fuel settled. The filter accumulated residue. The mixture occasionally needed adjustment when the engine load changed. A modern tractor allowed a farmer to concentrate on the field. This machine forced Walter to concentrate on the field and the fuel system. By noon, he'd covered less ground than he once would have before breakfast. But something else had happened. The fuel tank was almost untouched. Walter climbed down and looked into the gasifier's fuel container. The applewood had disappeared instead. Not magically. Not efficiently enough to make every modern fuel problem irrelevant. But usefully. Branches that had spent years beneath a shed had performed actual mechanical work. Walter picked up his notebook. He wrote, "Good under light load." Then, "Power loss under heavy pull." Then, "Fuel must stay consistent." He paused before adding one more line. "Useful is not equal to convenient." That distinction interested him. For decades, agriculture had moved toward convenience through specialization. Fuel came from somewhere else. Fertilizer came from somewhere else. Replacement parts came from somewhere else. Each system worked extremely well until price, supply, or availability became the problem. Elias's machine worked differently, poorly, by modern standards, but it turned something already on the farm into something the farm needed. Walter finished only a portion of the field that day. As he shut down, he opened the lower section of the gasifier. Ash fell first, then several black, lightweight pieces landed on the metal tray. Walter picked one up. Charred wood. Not completely ash. Carbon-rich material left behind by the process. He almost dumped it with the rest. Then he remembered another drawing in Elias's papers. One he hadn't understood. 3 boxes connected by arrows. The first said, "Orchard." The second, "Unit." The third, garden. Walter had assumed garden meant where Elias stored something. Now he wasn't sure. He returned to the house and spread the papers across the kitchen table. On the back of one sheet, barely visible in pencil, was another note. Char crush. Mix with manure first. Walter read it again. The tractor had already revealed one forgotten cycle. Orchard wood could become fuel. But Elias hadn't considered the black material left behind to be waste either. Walter looked through the window toward the 7-acre field. Then toward the manure pile behind the old cattle shed. The question had changed again. His father hadn't merely been trying to find a substitute for gasoline. He had been trying to figure out where everything left over could go next. The black material bothered Walter more than the tractor did. For a week, he kept a bucket of it beside the barn door. Lightweight, brittle, black enough to stain his fingers. It was what remained after orchard wood had helped move a tractor across a field. Walter could have dumped it with the ash. He almost had. Then he'd found his father's note. Char crush. Mix with manure first. Walter read those 6 words every morning. Elias hadn't written fertilizer. He hadn't written spread on field. And he certainly hadn't written miracle. He had written mix with manure first. That difference mattered. Behind the old cattle shed, Walter still had a pile of aged manure mixed with bedding and decomposed hay. He filled a wheelbarrow halfway. Then he crushed some of the cleaner char and worked it into the pile. Nothing happened. No heat. No smell. No miraculous transformation. Walter smiled. Good. Miracles were difficult to measure. He left the mixture alone. That evening, he searched Elias's remaining papers again. Most were ordinary notes, dimensions, repairs, fuel sizes. Then he found a damaged sheet folded beneath a drawing of the gasifier. It showed the orchard, rows of trees, several marked with an X. Beside one group, Elias had written char, manure, beside another, none. Walter leaned closer. 2 groups, one treated, one untreated. His father hadn't merely been using the black residue, he had been comparing it. The next morning, Walter carried the drawing into the orchard. Most of the original trees were gone, but the old spacing could still be traced. Near the eastern fence, he found what he believed was Elias's marked row. Walter knelt and pushed his fingers into the soil. Dark, soft beneath the leaf litter. For a moment, he wanted it to mean something. Then he stopped himself. 80 years had passed. Rain had moved soil. Roots had died. Leaves had fallen. Animals had crossed it. One old drawing couldn't prove that char had improved anything. Walter stood. The soil wasn't the discovery. The experiment was. Elias hadn't assumed his idea worked. He had tested it. Back at the kitchen table, Walter drew 3 words. Orchard wood. Below them, Gasifier. Then, tractor. That was the system he thought he'd inherited. But now he drew another arrow from the gasifier. Char, then, manure, then, soil. Walter stared at the page. The tractor wasn't the end of the process. Neither was the ashtray. His father had been asking the same question at every stage. What can this become next? Walter decided to repeat the experiment. Small. Controlled. 2 garden plots. Same size. Same basic treatment. Only one difference. In the first, Walter mixed a modest amount of the aged manure and char material into the soil. The second received none. Daniel found him measuring the plots with a tape. What are you doing now? Trying not to lie to myself. Daniel looked at the black mixture. You think that stuff fixes soil? Walter shook his head. I don't know. He held up Elias's drawing. And this doesn't know either. Daniel frowned. It's Dad's notes. It's evidence that he tried something, not evidence that it worked. Walter drove a stake into the ground. If this plot grows better, I want to know. If it doesn't, I want to know that too. Daniel watched him quietly. Walter realized that was the difference between inheriting an idea and worshiping it. His father didn't need to have been right about everything. He only needed to have asked a useful question. Over the following weeks, Walter kept records. Fuel condition, engine behavior, char collected, what went into each plot. No miracles appeared. That was fine. Something else had already changed. A dead branch was no longer automatically waste. Char wasn't automatically fertilizer. Manure wasn't simply something to move. Each material had properties. Each had limits. And sometimes the output of one job could become the beginning of another. One evening, Walter returned to his kitchen diagram. He had circled tractor days earlier. Now he crossed the circle out. The tractor had never been the center of Elias's idea. The arrows were. Walter looked through the window toward the orchard. For weeks, he'd thought his father had left him a forgotten machine. He was wrong. Elias had left him a way of looking at a farm. And suddenly Walter wondered how many things on his own land he had been paying to throw away, only to buy their replacement somewhere else. Walter had made the tractor run. That didn't mean he trusted it. Old machinery became dangerous. The moment a man confused working with safe. So before the fourth serious run, Walter called Ben Carter. Ben had spent 40 years repairing farm equipment and had the irritating habit of finding problems other men had already decided weren't there. He arrived Thursday morning. Walter expected him to admire the tractor. Ben didn't. He walked around it twice, touched the copper line, examined the gasifier, then crouched beside a fitting Walter had resealed only days earlier. Who built this? My father. When? Etienne Jobai Sushasan. Ben looked up. You've run it? 3 times. Ben removed his cap. Then you've been lucky 3 times. Walter's smile disappeared. Ben pointed toward the barn. We're not starting it again until we know where every bit of gas can go. They spent the morning taking apart what Walter had spent weeks rebuilding. Every fitting, every seal, every section of pipe. Ben found a hairline gap near an old threaded joint. Walter could barely see it. You worried about that? I'm worried about what you can't smell. Producer gas could contain carbon monoxide. A leaking gasoline line often announced itself. This system didn't have to. Inside a closed barn, a small failure could become fatal before anyone understood what was happening. Walter looked toward the open yard. That's why I've only run it outside. Ben nodded. Keep doing that. Then they opened the intake. A thin brown film remained inside. Ben touched it with a screwdriver. Tar. From the first test. You cleaned it? Twice. Good. Ben held up the stained screwdriver. Because this is the part nobody puts in the story. Walter frowned. What story? The one where a man throws sticks into a barrel and gets free fuel. Ben pointed toward the tractor. This isn't free. He pointed toward Walter's stacked applewood. You cut that. The gasifier. You dry it. Size it. Feed it. The filter. You clean this. Then the engine. And if you get any of those wrong, this pays for it. Walter said nothing. Ben handed the screwdriver back. You haven't found free fuel. Walter. He paused. You found another way to work for your fuel. Walter smiled slowly. That was the first thing anyone had said about the tractor that sounded exactly right. They continued. Separator. Filter. Intake. Mixer. Then Ben inspected Walter's prepared applewood. He picked up several pieces. Nearly identical size. Dry. Clean. No rot. This matters more than the machine. Ben said. Walter pulled Elias's note from his pocket. Apple and oak. Dry. Kutivan. Ben read it. Your father learned this the expensive way. Walter already had 2. Wet or uneven fuel could steal heat from the process. Poor conditions could produce dirtier gas. Tar could travel downstream. The tractor could run on wood gas. But only if Walter respected the narrow conditions that made it possible. That afternoon, they rolled the tractor into the open yard. Walter lit the gasifier. Then waited. Ben watched the joints. Walter watched the temperature. Neither man spoke. When the system was ready, Walter opened the mixer and pressed the starter. The engine turned. Cuffed. Then caught. Ben leaned close enough to listen, but not close enough to celebrate. Walter adjusted the mixture. The idle steadied. He selected gear. The tractor moved across the yard. Then Walter gave it moderate load. The engine pulled. Not strongly, not beautifully, but steadily. Walter made another pass. When he returned, Ben gave one small nod. It works. 2 words. That was all. Yet Walter felt something settle inside him. For weeks, he'd been the only man interpreting Elias's notes, diagnosing failures, and deciding whether each small success meant anything. Now someone who owed the story nothing had seen the machine work. Then Ben ruined the moment. Don't make it bigger than it is. Walter shut down the engine. What do you mean? This won't replace every diesel tractor in the county. I know. It takes labor. It takes dry fuel. It takes cleaning. And under a heavy pull, that engine is going to remind you why farmers liked liquid fuel. Walter looked toward the 7-acre field. I know that too. Ben studied him. Then what are you trying to prove? Walter almost answered immediately. Instead, he looked toward the orchard. Dead limbs, drying racks, the buckets of char beside the shed, then the old tractor. I'm not trying to prove it's better. Ben waited. I'm trying to find out where it's useful. That changed the conversation. Walter didn't need an 80-year-old machine to defeat modern agriculture. He needed it to perform certain jobs without purchasing fuel for every hour of work. Nothing more. Ben noticed the char buckets. What's that for? Walter showed him Elias's soil notes and the 2 test plots. Ben read them carefully. Careful. I am. This stuff isn't automatically some miracle soil treatment. Walter pointed toward the plots. That's why there are 2. Ben looked at him. Walter continued. One to test the idea. He pointed toward the untreated plot. And one to stop me from believing what I want to believe. For the first time that day, Ben smiled. By sunset, Walter understood what the inspection had really given him. Not approval. Limits. The tractor worked. The fuel worked. The char might prove useful under the right conditions, but none of them were miracles. And strangely, that made Walter trust the whole idea more. As Ben climbed into his truck, he looked back at the tractor. Your father built an interesting machine. Walter shook his head. I'm starting to think the machine was the least interesting part. That night, Walter returned to the kitchen diagram. Orchard. Wood. Energy. Char. Soil. For months he'd been asking whether one old tractor could save the farm. Ben had finally killed that question. Good. Because Walter was beginning to see a much larger one. What if the farm didn't need one thing to save it? What if it needed dozens of small things to stop leaving it? By late summer, Walter stopped measuring success by how long the tractor ran. He measured what stopped leaving the farm. That was different. Beside the machinery, shed stood 3 stacks of orchard wood. Fresh. Drying. Ready. Branches that once cost Walter time to pile, whole, or burn now had destinations before they were cut. The driest pieces went toward fuel. Unsuitable material stayed out. Char from the gasifier was collected separately instead of being dumped blindly onto the ground. Some was mixed with aged manure for Walter's small trial. Nothing moved automatically. Nothing was useful simply because Walter wanted it to be. That lesson had become the center of everything. One morning, Daniel found him at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Columns covered the page. What are you calculating? What leaves? Leaves where? The farm. Walter turned the pad around. Diesel. Fertilizer. Waste hauling. Repairs. Purchased inputs. Then another column. Orchard prunings. Manure. Char. Labor. Daniel studied the page. You're comparing manure to diesel? No. Walter tapped the paper. I'm comparing what I pay to bring in with what I pay to get rid of. Daniel looked again. Walter drew an arrow. Orchard wood. Another. Wood gasifier work. Then, a second line. Gasifier char. Then, char plus manure test plot. Daniel leaned against the table. So everything becomes something else? Walter shook his head. That distinction mattered too much to let pass. No. He crossed out the word everything. Some things can become something else. Wet wood could make poor fuel. Dirty gas could damage an engine. Too much char could be the wrong choice. A broken bearing was still a broken bearing. Waste didn't become valuable because a man drew arrows around it. It became valuable only when another part of the farm could actually use it. Walter looked at the diagram. For months, he'd thought Elias had left behind a clever tractor. Now that seemed almost embarrassingly small. The tractor was only one connection. The real idea was the space between things. A branch stopped being debris when it became suitable fuel. Fuel stopped being only fuel when one of its residues had another possible use. Manure stopped being merely a pile when it became part of a controlled soil experiment. Nothing miraculous had happened. Walter had simply stopped looking at each problem alone. That afternoon, he took the old tractor to the 7-acre field. It wasn't the fastest machine he owned. It wasn't the strongest. Under heavy load. It wasn't even the machine he preferred. But for a light job, with properly prepared wood already on the farm, it had a place. That was enough. Walter worked until the hopper needed attention. Then he stopped. Years earlier, stopping would have irritated him. Modern machinery had taught farmers to value uninterrupted work. Elias's system demanded something else. Attention. Walter checked the fuel, cleaned the filter, looked over the fittings, then started again. From the fence line, Daniel watched. When Walter finished the row, his son walked over. Still think this saves the farm? Walter shut down the engine. No. Daniel seemed surprised. Walter climbed from the seat. One tractor can't save a farm. He looked across the orchard. Neither can one crop, or one good year. Then why are you doing all this? Walter wiped his hands on a rag. Because saving isn't the same as needing less. Daniel said nothing. Walter pointed toward the old machine. If this does 10 jobs, I don't have to buy diesel for. That's 10 jobs. Then toward the orchard. If material I used to burn does useful work first. That's something. Then toward the garden plots. If that experiment fails, we stop doing it. Daniel smiled faintly. That's your grand plan? No. Walter looked across the farm. That's the point. There was no grand plan. Only dozens of small leaks. Money leaving. Materials leaving. Knowledge leaving. Choices disappearing one at a time. Elias hadn't made the farm independent in 1943. He had simply found one place where dependence could be reduced. Walter finally understood why that mattered. He returned to the kitchen that evening and looked at his diagram. For weeks, the tractor had sat in the center. Walter erased it. Then he drew a circle around the arrows. The machine had never been the inheritance. The connections were. And for the first time since the developer's offer arrived, Walter stopped asking what the farm was worth if he sold it. He began asking what it might cost to keep if fewer things had to come from somewhere else. The first person to call the tractor junk had been Walter himself. The second was Roy Miller, who bought scrap machinery from farms across the county. Roy had seen the tractor months earlier while pricing an old grain drill. He had kicked one cracked rear tire, looked beneath the hood for perhaps 10 seconds, and shrugged. I'd pay by weight. Walter hadn't been offended. At the time, he agreed. Now Roy was standing beside the same tractor. Watching its engine run on gas produced from dry orchard wood, he walked around it twice. What did you do to it? Mostly figured out what had already been done. Walter showed him the gasifier. Roy leaned closer. Your father built that? Most of it. And it actually works? Walter pointed toward a wagon loaded with split fence posts. Let's find out. He climbed onto the seat. The tractor moved slowly across the yard, pulling the wagon toward the barn. It wasn't impressive by modern standards. No roar. No cloud of triumph. Just an old engine doing useful work. But Roy watched until Walter shut it down. I wouldn't scrap that anymore, he said. Walter smiled. That sentence traveled farther than either man expected. Within 2 weeks, neighbors began stopping by. Some remembered hearing about wood gas vehicles from grandparents. Others came because they thought Walter had discovered a way to run machinery for free. That idea irritated him. No, Walter told them repeatedly, the wood isn't free. One man laughed and pointed toward the orchard. "It's lying on the ground." Walter handed him a saw. "Then cut it. Dry it. Size it. Store it. Clean the system afterward. And tell me it's free." The laughter stopped. Walter didn't want the tractor turned into a miracle. That would destroy the lesson. The system required labor. The engine lost power under heavy load. Fuel preparation mattered. Filters needed cleaning. The gas itself demanded serious safety precautions. For most modern farms, diesel remained vastly more practical. But practicality wasn't the same as value. Walter's machine demonstrated something else. A resource could be worthless in one system and useful in another. That became clear when Daniel brought the developer back to the farm. The offer for the 68 acres was still open. They stood near the orchard while Walter explained what he'd changed. He didn't show them a fantasy balance sheet. He showed them actual reductions. Selected light work moved to the old tractor. Woody residues were being separated instead of automatically discarded. Manure, compost, and selected char were being tested together in small plots. The changes hadn't made Walter rich. They had done something more important. They had lowered enough costs to buy him time. The developer looked across the property. "So you're turning down the offer?" Walter looked at Daniel. Months earlier, his son had asked why he kept land that wasn't paying him back. Now Daniel was looking at the orchard differently. Not because every acre had suddenly become profitable, because the farm had stopped behaving like a collection of unrelated expenses. Walter folded the offer. For now. That evening, Daniel stayed after everyone left. He stood beside the old tractor. "I thought you were trying to save this thing," he said. Walter wiped soot from the mixer valve. "I was." Daniel shook his head. "No. I mean at first." Walter understood. The tractor had seemed like another old object he couldn't let go. Another piece of the past. But the opposite had happened. Restoring it had forced Walter to examine the future. Daniel touched the handmade copper line beneath the hood. "What's it worth now?" Walter considered the question. As scrap, perhaps not much. As restored machinery, perhaps more. But neither answer felt accurate. He looked toward the orchard. The drying racks, the compost pile, and the 7-acre field. "The tractor?" Daniel nodded. Walter closed the hood. Wrong question. Because the most valuable thing Elias Hayes had left behind wasn't made of steel. It was the idea that had survived inside it. Everyone else had looked at an obsolete machine and asked what it could be sold for. Walter had finally asked what it could still teach him. And that difference had changed the value of everything around it. By October, the tractor no longer surprised Walter. That was how he knew the experiment had become useful. It wasn't a miracle sitting in the barn. It was a tool. Some mornings Walter used it. Other mornings he didn't. Heavy work still belonged to diesel. Wet wood stayed out of the gasifier. The soil trial remained a trial. Nothing on the farm had become magical simply because it was old. But something had changed. Walter had stopped asking one machine to save 112 acres. Instead, he asked smaller questions. What already existed here? What was being wasted? What could replace part of something he had to buy? And what wasn't worth doing at all? That autumn, Daniel came to help clear the orchard. They worked through the morning without saying much. Walter cut. Daniel sorted. Rotten wood went one direction. Suitable branches went beneath cover to dry. Years earlier, Walter would have burned nearly all of it. Daniel lifted a straight apple limb. This one? Walter examined it. Fuel pile. Daniel tossed it onto the stack. New argument. No joke. Just another piece of wood placed where it could become useful. Walter noticed. He said nothing. Lauter. They stopped beside the old tractor. Daniel wiped dust from the hood. You going to repaint it? Walter shook his head. Why not? Paint wasn't the part that needed saving. Daniel smiled. Walter opened the hood. The copper pipe was still ugly. The welds were still rough. His father's initials remained beneath the grease. E. H. Iten Jobai Sishasan. Walter had spent months trying to understand what Elias had built. Now he thought he finally did. Not a wood-powered tractor. That was only the visible part. Elias had built options. When gasoline became difficult to obtain, he found another fuel. When orchard wood became waste, he gave some of it another job. When the gasifier left char behind, he tested whether that residue might belong somewhere else. He hadn't eliminated dependence. He had reduced helplessness. Walter reached beneath the hood to tighten a loose bracket. His fingers touched metal where he hadn't noticed metal before. A thin plate sat behind the mounting rail. He removed 2 bolts and pulled it free. There was writing on the back. Faint. Scratched by hand. Walter carried it toward the doorway. Daniel followed. The first lines were ordinary. Valve position. A measurement. A reminder to clean the filter. Then, beneath them, one final sentence. Leave the boy enough to figure out the rest. Walter read it again. Daniel looked at him. The boy was you? Walter didn't answer. For months, he'd imagined his father leaving behind instructions. But Elias hadn't left complete instructions. There were missing parts, failed experiments, short notes, questions Walter had been forced to answer himself. Maybe that hadn't been an accident. Walter looked across the farm. The orchard was still old. The equipment was still worn. The bills hadn't disappeared. And the developer's offer was still worth real money. But Walter no longer felt cornered by any of them. He had something he'd nearly lost before opening that barn. Choices. He handed the plate to Daniel. Keep it. Daniel looked surprised. Why? Walter closed the tractor's hood. Because someday, you'll think I should have explained more. He started toward the orchard. Daniel remained beside the tractor. Did he? Walter turned. Did your father explain enough? Walter looked at Elias's initials one last time, then smiled. No. He picked up his saw. He left me enough to start. And together, father and son walked back toward the trees.